The living room was meticulously tidy, the throw pillows aligned just so on the sofa, a silent testament to routine in a quiet subdivision of Naperville, Illinois. But routine had ended here. Abruptly, violently. Sunlight, filtering through blinds, illuminated dust motes dancing above a dark, spreading stain on the taupe carpet. A single armchair was overturned near a coffee table holding two empty mugs and a remote control. The air hung still, heavy with the scent of ozone and something metallic. This was where the call originated. A frantic, breathless transmission received by the Naperville Police Department dispatch at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller identified himself as Mark Jenkins, reporting an incident at his residence on Maple Street. He was agitated, his voice thick with shock or something resembling it. Officers David Chen and Emily Carter were the first patrol units to arrive, pulling up to the split-level home. The front door stood ajar. From the street, the house appeared ordinary, indistinguishable from its neighbors. A well-maintained lawn, potted plants flanking the entrance, a child's bicycle lying on its side in the driveway. Inside, the ordinariness shattered. Officer Chen drew his weapon, announcing their presence as they entered the foyer. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the unnatural silence. Officer Carter moved through the kitchen, noting the undisturbed dishes in the sink, a grocery list pinned to the refrigerator door. Everything suggested recent, normal activity. Abruptly paused. The living room was through a short hallway. The scene was immediately apparent. A body lay near the overturned armchair. It was a woman, dressed in casual clothing. There was significant trauma. Officer Chen checked for vital signs, finding none. The dispatcher's voice crackled over his radio confirming the address, requesting backup, paramedics and a supervisor. The protocol was swift and precise. Secure the perimeter. Do not disturb the scene. Document initial observations. Officer Carter located Mark Jenkins in the kitchen, slumped against the counter, trembling. His hands were visibly shaking. There was a phone beside him. He did not look towards the living room. His gaze was fixed somewhere past the back door. He wore simple clothes, a t-shirt, and jeans. His face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused. He offered no resistance, no sudden movements. He simply existed in a state of apparent shock. Officer Chen relayed their findings. One deceased female, apparent gunshot wound. One male subject present, identified as the caller and husband. The address was 1784 Maple Street, Naperville. A sense of controlled urgency filled the small house as more sirens approached in the distance. The quiet Tuesday afternoon had been irrevocably broken. The scene itself was a contradiction. Domestic tranquility disrupted by sudden, brutal violence. The undisturbed elements, the tidy room, the mugs, the grocery list, stood in stark opposition to the finality of death just feet away. It was clear this was not a random act of violence. This was personal. This had happened within the confines of a home, between people who presumably knew each other intimately. The immediate priority was to establish the circumstances leading to the event, and to understand the relationship between the deceased and the man sitting in the kitchen. The methodical process of uncovering the truth had just begun, starting with the man who called 911. The silence in the living room was surgical, sharp and absolute, punctuated only by the approaching wail of emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed closely by additional patrol units and detectives from the Naperville Police Department's Major Crimes Unit. The house on Maple Street was quickly cordoned off with yellow crime tape, a stark visual indicator transforming a private tragedy into a public investigation. Officer Chen remained with Mark Jenkins in the kitchen, ensuring he remained calm and did not re-enter the living room. Officer Carter provided initial details to the arriving supervisor, Sergeant Miller. The deceased female was identified by Mark Jenkins as his wife, Sarah Jenkins. Her age was reported as 4. Sergeant Miller entered the living room cautiously, his eyes scanning the scene. He noted the position of the body, the distribution of blood spatter, the location of the overturned furniture. Every detail was a potential clue. A single shell casing was observed near the body. The firearm was not immediately visible in the living room. This was noted and relayed to the detectives gathering outside. The lead investigator, Detective Ray Peterson, a seasoned officer known for his meticulous approach, arrived shortly thereafter. He conferred with Sergeant Miller, receiving a summary of the initial findings in Mark Jenkins's presence. Detective Peterson entered the scene, his expression impassive. He moved slowly, methodically, his gaze taking in every surface, every object. Crime scene technicians began their careful work, photographing the scene from multiple angles before anything was moved or processed. They documented the precise location of the body, the shell casing, the furniture, and the bloodstain, the temperature of the room, the status of lights and appliances. Even the level of liquid in the abandoned mugs were recorded. This initial phase was critical, capturing the scene exactly as it was found, preserving what could easily be lost. Mark Jenkins was escorted out of the house by Officer Chen and placed in the back of a patrol car to be transported to the police station for a formal interview. He went cooperatively, appearing dazed. He made no requests, asked no questions about his wife. This observation was noted by the officer. Outside, neighbors began to gather, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. The quiet anonymity of suburban life had been shattered by the visible presence of law enforcement. They exchanged hushed whispers, trying to piece together what could have happened inside the seemingly ordinary house. No one reported hearing gunshots. No one reported seeing anything unusual leading up to the arrival of the police. This lack of prior alarm added another layer of complexity to the event. It suggested the incident was sudden, unexpected, confined within the walls of the home. The crime scene technicians marked and collected the shell casing, carefully bagging it as evidence. They began processing surfaces for fingerprints and searching for the firearm. The search was thorough, expanding from the living room to the rest of the house. Upstairs bedrooms, bathrooms, the basement, every area was examined systematically. The discovery of the firearm was crucial. It was located in the kitchen, underneath the sink, wrapped in a dish rag. It was a handgun. This find immediately raised questions. Why was it moved? Why was it hidden? These questions would form a central part of the investigation into Mark Jenkins's actions and state of mind. The crime scene documentation continued for several hours. The body of Sarah Jenkins remained in the living room, a somber focal point of the meticulous forensic work. Investigators knew that the physical evidence at the scene, combined with witness statements and background information, would be essential in reconstructing the events that occurred in the quiet Naperville living room. The process was slow, methodical, and emotionally draining for all involved, yet necessary to uncover the truth hidden within the domestic space. The deceased woman was formally identified as Sarah Ann Jenkins. Age: Mark Jenkins, her husband of 5 years, confirmed her identity at the police station, although he was not taken to view the body. Initial inquiries into the background of Sarah and Mark Jenkins revealed a picture of a seemingly normal, suburban couple. Sarah worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm in downtown Chicago, commuting by train each day. Colleagues described her as quiet, professional, and highly competent. Mark was a project manager for a construction company based in the suburbs. Friends and neighbors characterized them as private but friendly, occasionally seen walking their dog or working in their yard. They had no children. There were no reported incidents of domestic disputes called to the police prior to this day. Their lives appeared unremarkable, following the predictable rhythm of middle-class suburban existence. Investigators began the task of building a comprehensive picture of Sarah Jenkins. Her workplace was contacted, supervisors and colleagues interviewed. They spoke of a dedicated employee, polite and reserved. No one reported any significant personal problems or conflicts. She rarely discussed her private life. This reticence, previously seen as simple professionalism, now seemed significant in light of the circumstances of her death. Friends were contacted. Several described Sarah and Mark as a devoted couple, seemingly happy together. They attended occasional social gatherings, hosted dinners. No one recalled any specific arguments or signs of strain in the marriage. Mark Jenkins, meanwhile, was undergoing formal questioning at the police station. His initial statement to Detective Peterson was disjointed, marked by periods of silence and apparent distress. He reiterated his call to 911, stating he had found his wife deceased in the living room. When pressed for details leading up to the discovery, his account became vague. He spoke of being home, of hearing a noise, of finding Sarah. The firearm, its location under the sink, was a critical point of inquiry. Mark Jenkins admitted to moving the gun, stating he was in a state of panic and didn't know what to do. He claimed the gun belonged to him, kept for home security. He did not initially offer a clear explanation for why Sarah was shot. His narrative focused on the shock of finding her. This initial interview lasted for several hours. Mark Jenkins was not immediately arrested. The investigation was still in its early stages, requiring careful collection of evidence and corroboration of his statement. However, the inconsistencies and omissions in his account were notable. His explanation for moving the weapon was plausible in a state of panic, but the deliberate act of wrapping it and placing it under the sink raised questions about intent and composure. Furthermore, his description of hearing a noise and then finding his wife dead lacked crucial detail about the intervening moments. Did he investigate the noise? Where was he when he heard it? What was his immediate reaction upon seeing Sarah? His responses were evasive, or nonspecific on these points. The contrast between the apparent normalcy of the Jenkinses' public life and the violence that had occurred inside their home was stark. Investigators knew that the key to understanding what happened lay not just in the physical evidence, but in peeling back the layers of the couple's private life, and specifically in delving deeper into Mark Jenkins's account of the events of that afternoon on Maple Street. The truth was likely hidden beneath the surface of their carefully constructed suburban existence. The formal interview with Mark Jenkins continued. Detective Peterson systematically worked through the timeline leading up to the shooting. Mark's story was that he was in the basement watching television when he heard a loud noise from upstairs. He came up to investigate and found Sarah in the living room. The critical moment, the source of the violence, remained obscured by his narrative. He claimed he did not see anyone else in the house. This contradicted the apparent circumstances. A single gunshot wound inflicted at close range suggested the perpetrator was present in the room. When asked directly about the possibility of an intruder, Mark was hesitant, unable to confirm or deny. He kept returning to his state of shock upon discovering his wife. The focus of the interview shifted to the nature of their relationship. Mark described a happy marriage, free of major conflict. He spoke of future plans, of their life together. This portrayal seemed at odds with the violent outcome. Detective Peterson gently probed for any recent disagreements, any underlying tensions, any secrets. Mark maintained the image of a stable relationship. However, the detective noted subtle shifts in his demeanor when discussing certain topics. There was a point where the questioning touched upon Sarah's past, her life before they met 5 years prior. Mark became visibly more uncomfortable. His responses shorter, his gaze dropping. He offered little detail about her history, stating she didn't talk about it much. This reticence, whether his or Sarah's, was flagged by investigators as potentially significant. The discovery of the firearm in the kitchen, wrapped in a dish rag, remained a major point of contention. Mark's explanation of panic did not fully account for the deliberate act of concealing it. Ballistics testing would confirm if it was the weapon used in the shooting. The medical examiner's preliminary findings were also starting to come in, providing crucial forensic details about Sarah Jenkins's death. The single gunshot wound was confirmed as the cause of death. The trajectory and range would be further analyzed, offering clues about the distance between the shooter and the victim. These forensic details would be compared against Mark Jenkins's account of finding his wife. A key element emerging from the forensic examination of Sarah Jenkins's body was the confirmation of certain biological characteristics that were not immediately apparent externally and which contradicted her presentation and identity as female. This was a critical, unexpected development in the investigation, introducing a new layer of complexity. It indicated that Sarah Ann Jenkins, as known to her husband in the world, possessed biological traits typically associated with men. This finding was profound and immediately prompted investigators to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the victim and her marriage. It suggested a significant aspect of Sarah's identity had been concealed, at least from some. The question now became, had Mark Jenkins known this? And if he had discovered it, could this have been the catalyst for the violence? The police hypothesis began to shift dramatically. The narrative of a simple domestic dispute or an intruder scenario became less likely. Instead, the focus sharpened on the relationship between Mark and Sarah, and the potential impact of this hidden truth on their marriage. This forensic reveal in the quiet Naperville home fundamentally altered the direction of the investigation, transforming a tragic shooting into something far more complex and unsettling. The truth hidden beneath Sarah Jenkins's public identity was now exposed, and its connection to the events on Maple Street needed to be fully understood. The forensic revelation regarding Sarah Jenkins's biological characteristics sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. Detectives had to grapple with the possibility that the victim had been living with a concealed identity, and perhaps more importantly, that her husband may not have been aware of it until shortly before her death. The crime scene was revisited with this new information in mind. Were there any signs in the house? Any personal belongings? Any documents that hinted at this hidden aspect of Sarah's life? Crime scene technicians conducted a more targeted search. They meticulously examined personal effects, photographs, computer files, and any correspondence found in the house. Initial searches had focused on typical evidence related to a shooting. Now, they were looking for anything that could shed light on Sarah's past and her true identity. Meanwhile, investigators delved deeper into Sarah's history before her marriage to Mark. This proved challenging. Sarah had apparently kept her past private. Public records, social media, and previous addresses were scrutinized. They discovered that Sarah had moved to the Naperville area about 6 years prior, just before meeting Mark. Her life before that was difficult to trace. Previous residences in other states yielded little information. It seemed she had deliberately created a new life, leaving her past behind. Colleagues and friends, interviewed again, were asked if they had ever suspected anything unusual about Sarah, anything that didn't align with her presentation as a woman. Uniformly, the answer was no. Everyone who knew Sarah Jenkins in Naperville knew her as female. This reinforced the idea that her concealment was effective. The focus returned to Mark Jenkins. His earlier discomfort when discussing Sarah's past during the interview now seemed highly significant. Was this discomfort due to his own ignorance? Or was he actively concealing his knowledge? Investigators needed to determine if and when Mark Jenkins discovered the truth about his wife's biological sex. This became the central question driving the investigation. They looked for any evidence of recent conflict, any signs of distress in the marriage that might be linked to such a revelation. Neighbors were re-interviewed, asked about any unusual arguments or changes in the couple's behavior in the days or weeks leading up to the shooting. Again, most reported nothing out of the ordinary. A few mentioned seeing Mark looking stressed recently, but attributed it to work pressure. There was no outward sign of a marriage in crisis, let alone one facing a revelation of this magnitude. The initial forensic report from the medical examiner provided crucial details about the nature of the gunshot wound, including the likely distance from which the shot was fired. This information, when combined with the layout of the living room and the position of the body, helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. The trajectory suggested a close-range shot, consistent with an altercation within the room. This contradicted Mark's account of simply finding his wife deceased. It implied he was present, and likely involved, at the moment she was shot. The presence of the firearm under the sink, away from the scene and wrapped, further pointed towards a deliberate act of concealment, potentially indicating guilt or an attempt to control the narrative. The emerging picture was one of a hidden identity colliding with a brutal act of violence, with Mark Jenkins at the center. The challenge for investigators was to definitively link Mark's knowledge of Sarah's biological sex to the shooting and to determine if this discovery was, in fact, the motive. The quiet suburban home on Maple Street now held the weight of a profound secret, and its deadly consequences. Investigators continued to piece together Sarah Jenkins's past. Despite the challenges, they managed to trace her life back further than her arrival in Naperville. Records indicated she had lived in several states before settling in Illinois. They uncovered evidence that suggested Sarah had been living as female for many years, having undergone gender-affirming treatments and legally changing her name. She had built a life, a career, and relationships based on her identity as a woman. The revelation that she was biologically male at birth was a fact she had chosen to keep private, a deeply personal aspect of her history. The investigation now centered on determining the likelihood that Mark Jenkins was unaware of this. Could a husband be married to someone for 5 years and not know such a fundamental biological fact? While not impossible, it raised questions about the intimacy and honesty within the marriage. Detectives theorized two main possibilities. Either Mark genuinely discovered the truth recently, or he had known all along and there was another motive for the shooting. His reaction and statement following the event became even more critical to analyze. His apparent shock and disjointed narrative could be interpreted as genuine distress from a sudden, devastating discovery, or as a performance to conceal his true motive. They looked for any communication between Mark and Sarah that hinted at tension, arguments, or discussions about her past or identity. Their electronic devices were seized and forensically examined. Text messages, emails, call logs, everything was scrutinized for clues. Initially, these communications appeared unremarkable. Typical exchanges between a married couple about daily life, errands, and work. There were no obvious signs of imminent conflict. However, a deeper forensic dive into deleted data on Mark's phone revealed something significant. Recovered search history showed searches conducted in the days leading up to the shooting related to gender transition, biological sex, and legal name changes. The dates of these searches were critical. They occurred within the week before Sarah's death. This provided strong circumstantial evidence that Mark Jenkins had recently been seeking information related to the very secret Sarah had kept hidden. It suggested he was actively investigating something about her identity. This discovery profoundly weakened Mark's claim of simply finding his wife dead. It pointed towards a recent revelation and potential conflict. The timeline was starting to coalesce. Mark's online research into gender identity, followed days later by his wife's death from a gunshot wound in their living room, and his subsequent hesitant statement and attempt to conceal the weapon. The prosecution's theory of the case began to solidify. Mark Jenkins had discovered his wife's biological history. This discovery led to a confrontation, and that confrontation escalated into violence. The motive, chillingly, appeared to be rooted in his reaction to this profound personal truth about his partner. The evidence of his online searches provided a powerful narrative link between the revelation and the act. It was a pivotal piece of evidence, transforming the case from an unexplained death into a suspected homicide driven by a specific, explosive motive. The seemingly stable suburban marriage now appeared to have harbored a secret that, once exposed, had deadly consequences. The meticulous forensic work, initially focused on the scene of the crime, had led investigators back in time, uncovering a digital footprint that spoke volumes about Mark Jenkins's state of mind and potential actions in the days before the tragedy on Maple Street. With the digital evidence pointing strongly towards Mark Jenkins having recently discovered his wife's biological past, the investigation focused on building a case for intentional homicide. The inconsistencies in Mark's initial statements, his admission of moving the firearm, and the forensic evidence from the scene, close-range shot, blood spatter analysis suggesting presence during the event, were now interpreted through the lens of this probable motive. Detectives conducted follow-up interviews with Mark Jenkins. Confronted with the evidence of his internet search history, his demeanor shifted. He became defensive, evasive, and eventually requested a lawyer. This refusal to answer further questions cemented investigators' belief that he was concealing the full truth of what occurred. The timeline, as reconstructed by investigators, suggested a scenario where Mark confronted Sarah about his discovery. The location of the shooting, the living room, a common space for Aiko, supported the idea of a conversation that escalated. The single gunshot indicated a sudden final act. The absence of forced entry or other signs of struggle beyond the immediate incident suggested the violence was internal to the household. Ballistics confirmed the handgun found under the sink was the weapon that fired the fatal shot. Analysis of Sarah Jenkins's clothing and the placement of the wound provided further details about the angle and proximity of the firearm when discharged. These forensic details were meticulously documented and would be presented as evidence. The prosecution's case would argue that Mark Jenkins, upon discovering his wife's past, felt deceived and betrayed. This emotional reaction, fueled by anger or shock, led him to retrieve the firearm and shoot Sarah during a confrontation in the living room. His subsequent actions, calling 911 but being vague about the circumstances, moving and hiding the gun, would be presented as evidence of consciousness of guilt, an attempt to distance himself from the immediate act and control the scene. The defense, anticipating this, would likely argue that Mark's actions were those of a man in shock and panic after a devastating, unexpected discovery. They might portray the shooting as accidental during a struggle, or even as a reaction to perceived aggression from Sarah, although the lack of significant defensive wounds on Sarah would make this difficult to argue convincingly. The crucial point of contention in any potential trial would be Mark Jenkins's state of mind at the time of the shooting and the direct link between his discovery and the use of lethal force. The investigation gathered further background information on both Mark and Sarah, looking for any history of violence or volatility, any prior indication that Mark might react with extreme aggression to unexpected or challenging situations. Neither's history revealed such a pattern. They were, to all outward appearances, ordinary people living ordinary lives. This ordinariness, contrasted with the extraordinary violence and the hidden truth at the heart of the case, made the tragedy particularly haunting. The prosecution was building a case based on circumstantial evidence, the digital footprint, the firearm, the forensic scene, and the absence of any credible alternative explanation for Sarah's death. The motive, while deeply personal and rooted in a reaction to identity, fit the available facts. The quiet streets of Naperville, where neighbors had known the Jenkins as a happy couple, now grappled with the grim reality of a marriage shattered by a secret and ending in bloodshed. The case was moving towards the next phase: formal charges and the legal battle to determine Mark Jenkins's culpability for the death of his wife, Sarah Ann Jenkins. Based on the evidence gathered, the forensic findings confirming Sarah Jenkins's biological history, Mark Jenkins's recent internet searches related to that history, his inconsistent statements, and his handling of the firearm, prosecutors in DuPage County, Illinois, made the decision to charge Mark Jenkins with first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Sarah Ann Jenkins. The charge alleged that Mark Jenkins knowingly and intentionally caused the death of Sarah Jenkins. The narrative presented by the prosecution was that Mark discovered his wife's secret, confronted her, and that confrontation resulted in her death by his hand. Mark Jenkins was formally arrested and held without bond. The legal proceedings began with his arraignment. He entered a plea of not guilty. The case was assigned to a judge, and pretrial motions commenced. The defense immediately challenged the admissibility of key evidence, including Mark's internet search history and his initial statements to police, arguing he was not properly informed of his rights. These legal maneuvers were standard, setting the stage for the battle over the narrative of events. The prosecution meticulously prepared their case, focusing on presenting a clear chronological account supported by the physical and digital evidence. They would argue that the discovery of Sarah's biological past was a profound shock to Mark, leading to an explosive reaction that culminated in violence. They would emphasize the deliberate nature of the shooting, the close range, and Mark's actions afterward as evidence of intent and guilt. The defense team began constructing their counter-narrative. They were likely to argue that the shooting was not premeditated or intentional, but rather a tragic accident that occurred during a moment of extreme emotional distress and shock. They might attempt to portray Sarah's concealment of her past as a form of deception that contributed to Mark's state of mind. Their challenge would be to explain the firearm's concealment and the lack of a credible alternative scenario. The human element of the case became starkly apparent during this legal phase. Sarah Jenkins, the victim, was mourned by colleagues and friends who knew her as Sarah, a woman. Many struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the complex details of her past and the violent circumstances of her death. For Sarah's biological family, if they were located, the news would be doubly devastating. Learning of her death, and perhaps for some, learning about the life she had built away from them. Mark Jenkins's family and friends expressed shock and disbelief, describing him as a quiet, nonviolent man. They struggled to understand how he could be involved in such an act. The legal proceedings stripped away the privacy of the Jenkins's marriage, exposing its most intimate and painful secrets to public scrutiny. The case garnered significant attention, not only because of the tragic death, but because of the unique and sensitive nature of the alleged motive. The quiet suburban tragedy had become a complex legal battle centered on identity, secrecy, and the devastating consequences of a partner's reaction to a hidden truth. The path to trial was set, promising a detailed examination of the moments leading up to the shooting and the life Sarah Jenkins had built. The trial of Mark Jenkins for the murder of his wife, Sarah Ann Jenkins, began in the DuPage County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled with members of the public, journalists, and individuals connected to the victim and the defendant. The prosecution opened their case by presenting the grim scene found on Maple Street. Lead prosecutor Sarah Kim described the meticulously tidy living room contrasting with the violence, the single gunshot, the body of Sarah Jenkins. She laid out the prosecution's theory that Mark Jenkins, upon discovering his wife's biological male identity, felt betrayed and enraged, leading him to shoot her. She presented the evidence methodically, the 911 highlighting Mark's vague and inconsistent report, the testimony of Officer Chen and Carter, detailing the scene and Mark's demeanor, the crime scene technicians, who presented photographic evidence of the living room and the discovery of the wrapped firearm under the kitchen sink, the ballistics expert, confirming the firearm found was the murder weapon, and discussing the likely distance of the shot. The medical examiner testified about Sarah Jenkins's cause of death and the forensic findings regarding her biological sex, explaining the medical details in clinical terms. This testimony was crucial, providing the factual basis for the hidden identity at the heart of the case. The prosecution then presented the evidence of Mark Jenkins's internet search history from the days before the shooting, showing queries related to gender identity and biological sex. This was presented as powerful circumstantial evidence of his recent discovery and a direct link to the motive. They argued this digital footprint proved he was actively investigating something significant about Sarah just before her death. Witnesses who knew Sarah testified, describing her as a woman, a colleague, a friend. Their testimony underscored the life she had built and the effectiveness of her concealment. Friends of the couple testified about their seemingly normal marriage, their accounts highlighting the contrast between their public image and the violent private reality. The defense, led by attorney John Miller, countered by arguing that the shooting was not intentional murder, but a tragic accident that occurred during a moment of extreme emotional shock and distress. They argued that Mark's discovery of his wife's biological history was a profound and destabilizing event, leading to panic and a loss of control. Mark Jenkins took the stand in his own defense. He described his life with Sarah, portraying their marriage as loving and stable. He recounted the day of the shooting, claiming he was in the basement when he heard a noise. He testified that he came upstairs and found Sarah in the living room, and it was at that moment that the truth about her identity was revealed to him. His testimony regarding the shooting itself was central and highly contested. He claimed there was a struggle, a sudden, chaotic moment involving the firearm, and that the gun discharged accidentally. He described being in shock and panic afterward, leading him to move the gun and call. Under cross-examination by the prosecution, Mark Jenkins was pressed on the details of the alleged struggle, his specific actions, and the timing of his discovery relative to the gunshot. The prosecution challenged his account of an accidental shooting, pointing to the close range and the forensic evidence inconsistent with a struggle over the weapon. They highlighted the deliberate nature of his actions in concealing the firearm as evidence contradicting his claim of pure panic. The cross-examination was intense, focusing on the discrepancies between his testimony and the physical evidence. The emotional weight of the case was palpable, particularly during testimony regarding Sarah's life and the details of her death. The jury was tasked with weighing the evidence, the forensic details, the witness testimony and Mark Jenkins's own account to determine if he was guilty of intentionally murdering his wife, or if the shooting was a lesser charge, perhaps manslaughter, resulting from extreme emotional disturbance. The outcome hinged on their interpretation of Mark Jenkins's state of mind, at the critical moment in the true sequence of events in the living room on Maple Street. The trial proceeded through weeks of detailed testimony and evidence presentation. The prosecution systematically built its case, presenting expert witnesses who testified on blood spatter analysis, firearm functionality and digital forensics, all supporting the narrative of an intentional shooting following a recent unsettling discovery. The blood spatter pattern analysis suggested the shooter was in close proximity to Sarah Jenkins when the shot was fired, and that there was no significant movement or struggle beforehand that would create the observed patterns, directly contradicting Mark Jenkins's testimony of a chaotic struggle. The digital forensics expert provided detailed evidence of Mark's internet search history, showing the precise dates and times he searched for terms related to gender identity and transition. This expert explained how deleted search history was recovered and authenticated, demonstrating Mark's deliberate attempt to conceal this activity. This evidence was a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument regarding motive and timing of the revelation. The defense attempted to introduce testimony about the psychological impact of suddenly discovering a spouse's concealed identity, arguing that such a shock could induce a state of extreme emotional disturbance, potentially reducing the charge from murder to manslaughter. However, the prosecution countered that while the discovery was undoubtedly significant, Mark's actions retrieving a firearm, aiming and firing were not the actions of someone merely in a state of passive shock, but indicative of a deliberate act fueled by anger or other strong emotion. They highlighted the calculated act of concealing the weapon as evidence of a clear mind and consciousness of guilt after the fact. The defense also called character witnesses who testified to Mark Jenkins's reputation as a calm, non-violent individual, arguing that the events were entirely out of character for him and must have resulted from an extraordinary circumstance like the shock he described. However, the prosecution argued that even seemingly ordinary people are capable of extraordinary acts under certain pressures, and that the motive here was clear, a violent reaction to a perceived betrayal, and a profound challenge to his understanding of his marriage and his wife. The closing arguments summarized the complex evidence. The prosecution reiterated their stance that the digital footprint proved Mark knew, and his actions proved intent. They asked the jury to find him guilty of first-degree murder, arguing that the evidence was clear he reacted with lethal force upon discovering his wife's true history. The defense passionately argued for a lesser charge, emphasizing the emotional turmoil Mark experienced and portraying the shooting as a tragic, impulsive act born of shock and confusion, not premeditated malice. They urged the jury to consider the context of the revelation and the psychological state it would induce in an ordinary person. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Mark Jenkins was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict indicated the jury believed the prosecution's case, that Mark Jenkins intentionally killed his wife, and that the discovery of her biological history was the motive. The clinical presentation of the forensic and digital evidence, combined with the inconsistencies in Mark's own account, proved more persuasive than the defense's argument of accidental shooting or extreme emotional disturbance, reducing culpability. The quiet suburban living room, once a scene of domestic life, was now definitively the scene of a homicide, its purpose tragically redefined by the events of that Tuesday afternoon. Following the guilty verdict, the sentencing phase of the trial commenced. In Illinois, the penalty for first-degree murder typically ranges from 20 years to life imprisonment. Both the prosecution and the defense presented arguments regarding the appropriate sentence for Mark Jenkins. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the act, the use of a firearm, and the devastating impact on Sarah Jenkins's life, which was brutally cut short. They argued that the alleged motive, Mark's reaction to his wife's identity, demonstrated a disturbing intolerance and warranted a severe penalty. They highlighted the violation of the sanctity of marriage and the home where the crime occurred. Sarah's friends and colleagues submitted victim impact statements, speaking of their grief in the loss of a kind, talented individual. While respecting the sensitivity of her full history, they focused on the person they knew and loved, emphasizing the tragedy of her life being ended so violently. The defense pleaded for leniency, reiterating the argument that the crime was not premeditated and occurred during a moment of extreme emotional turmoil brought on by a shocking discovery. They spoke of Mark Jenkins's lack of prior criminal history, his character witnesses, and the profound impact his actions had already had on his own life and family. They argued that a lengthy sentence would serve no further purpose, and asked the judge to consider a sentence closer to the minimum. Mark Jenkins was given an opportunity to make a statement. He spoke haltingly, expressing remorse for the events, but his words were carefully chosen, not fully admitting intent, still clinging to the narrative of a moment that spiraled out of control. The judge, after considering the evidence presented during the trial, the jury's verdict, the sentencing guidelines, and the arguments from both sides, rendered the sentence. Mark Jenkins was sentenced to a significant prison term, reflecting the court's view of the seriousness of the crime and the deliberate nature of the act, as determined by the jury. The specific term underscored the legal system's finding that his reaction to his wife's identity was not a mitigating factor that excused intentional lethal force. With the sentencing concluded, the legal process drew to a close, though the impact of the events on Maple Street would resonate for years. The quiet street in Naperville slowly returned to its routines, but the house where Sarah Jenkins died remained a somber reminder of the tragedy. For Sarah's friends and those who knew her, the full truth of her life and death was a complex, painful legacy. The case brought to light not only a shocking act of domestic violence, but also the deeply personal struggles of identity and the devastating consequences when hidden truths collide with intolerance and violence. Sarah Ann Jenkins, the graphic designer, the friend, the wife, was gone. Her life, built with such apparent care and privacy, ended in the most public and violent way, in the seemingly safe confines of her own home, at the hands of the man she had married. The memory of the tidy living room, forever stained by violence, and a revealed secret, served as a haunting final image of a life tragically extinguished. The aftermath of the trial left a lasting impact on the community and the lives touched by the tragedy. The house on Maple Street, eventually sold, its history a quiet burden carried by new occupants. Neighbors who had known Sarah and Mark struggled to reconcile the ordinary couple they saw with the extraordinary violence that had occurred. The revelation about Sarah's biological past added a layer of complexity to their grief and understanding. For some, it was a point of quiet contemplation about the hidden lives people lead. For others, perhaps a source of confusion or discomfort. The media coverage, while extensive during the trial, eventually waned, but the story lingered in hushed conversation. Sarah Jenkins's death became a stark, grim example of how deeply personal truths can sometimes intersect with devastating violence. Her life, lived with such care and privacy regarding her identity, was posthumously exposed in the most public forum. The courtroom. This final involuntary act of exposure was another layer of tragedy. Her friends mourned the loss of the Sarah they knew, remembering her kindness, her professionalism, her quiet strength. For them, the details of her biological past did not diminish the reality of the woman she was. They remembered the person who commuted to Chicago, designed graphics, and shared quiet moments. Her death left a void, a sense of injustice that her life ended over something so intrinsically a part of who she was. Mark Jenkins began serving his prison sentence. His life, too, was irrevocably changed, defined now by the single violent act committed in his living room. The privacy he and Sarah had seemed to cherish was utterly annihilated by the trial. Every detail of their lives, particularly the most sensitive one, dissected in public. The motive, as determined by the court, his reaction to his wife's identity, underscored a profound failure of acceptance and a brutal response to a challenging personal truth. The case raised broader, quiet questions about trust, honesty, and what happens when fundamental aspects of identity are concealed or revealed within intimate relationships. It highlighted the potential for devastating consequences when individuals are unable or unwilling to accept truths that challenge their preconceived notions or expectations. The silence in the Naperville living room on that Tuesday afternoon, broken by a gunshot, ultimately revealed not just a crime but the painful, complex reality of a life lived privately and ended violently. The story of Sarah Ann Jenkins is a somber reminder that even in the most ordinary settings, hidden lives and sudden revelations can lead to unimaginable tragedy. The quiet devastation of that day on Maple Street rippled outwards, a haunting testament to the human cost of secrets and the violence that can erupt when they are exposed. The legal avenues for Mark Jenkins were not entirely exhausted. His defense team filed an appeal, citing several points of contention from the trial, including the admissibility of the internet search history and the court's handling of arguments regarding extreme emotional disturbance. The appellate process, however, is lengthy and often results in upholding the original verdict unless significant legal errors are identified. While the appeal was pending, life for those left behind continued, albeit forever altered. For Sarah Jenkins's friends, the process of grieving was complicated by the public nature of her death and the revelations about her past. They navigated this complex landscape, honoring the woman they knew while grappling with the details that emerged. Support systems for transgender individuals and their allies quietly noted the case as a tragic illustration of the potential dangers faced by those whose identities are not understood or accepted, particularly within intimate relationships. It underscored the vulnerability that can exist even within seemingly secure domestic spaces, when a partner reacts with violence to a fundamental truth about who someone is. The house on Maple Street stood, physically unchanged but marked by the events that had occurred within its walls. It was a silent monument to a private life that became a public spectacle and a tragic end. The street itself, like many suburban streets, maintained its appearance of normalcy. But for those who lived there during that time, the memory of the yellow crime tape, the constant presence of police and the knowledge of what had transpired inside number 7, the details of the case meticulously laid out during the trial, painted a picture not just of a single act of violence, but of the intricate layers of a life lived with a profound personal truth, and the catastrophic impact of that truth's collision with another person's inability to accept it. The narrative of Sarah Jenkins's life and death became a cautionary tale, discussed in hushed tones, analyzed in legal circles, and felt deeply by those who lost her. The sentence handed down to Mark Jenkins offered a measure of legal finality, but it could not restore the life that was lost or erase the pain inflicted. The quiet town of Naperville had witnessed a tragedy that exposed the vulnerability of private lives and the potential for violence hidden beneath the surface of suburban tranquility. The echoes of the single gunshot in the living room resonated far beyond the walls of the house, a haunting reminder of the secrets people keep and the devastating cost when they are revealed in the most brutal ways. The memory of Sarah Jenkins, the woman who commuted to Chicago, the friend, the wife, persisted, a poignant counterpoint to the grim legal narrative of her final moments. Years passed since the day the police lights first flashed on Maple Street. Mark Jenkins remained incarcerated, his appeals exhausted or unsuccessful. The legal system had rendered its judgment, assigning culpability for the death of Sarah Ann Jenkins. Yet the human dimensions of the tragedy persisted. The friends of Sarah continued to remember her, often privately, sharing memories of the woman they knew. The sensational aspects of the case faded from public memory, replaced by new headlines, but the core facts remained. A life ended by violence, a secret revealed in the most brutal way, within the confines of a shared home. The house on Maple Street changed hands, new families living lives unaware of the history etched into its walls, or perhaps choosing to look past it. But for those who remembered, driving past it still evoked a sense of somber reflection. The quiet, tree-lined street, so emblematic of suburban peace, held a story of profound disruption and loss. The narrative of Sarah Jenkins's life, though tragically defined by its end and the circumstances surrounding it, also served for some as a quiet testament to the strength and complexity of identity. She had built a life, maintained relationships, and contributed to her community, all while navigating a deeply personal truth in a world not always understanding. The violence she faced was a stark reminder of the dangers inherent when such truths encounter fear, prejudice, or an inability to cope with unexpected reality within intimate spaces. The case left no easy answers, only lingering questions about relationships, trust, and the capacity for violence in seemingly ordinary people. It highlighted the often unseen struggles individuals face, and the devastating consequences when intolerance takes a lethal form. The memory of the tidy living room, the site of Sarah Jenkins's death, remained a powerful, haunting image. It represented the shattering of a domestic ideal, the intrusion of brutal reality into a space meant for comfort and security. It was a reminder that even behind closed doors, hidden truths and human reactions can lead to irreparable harm. The legacy of the events on Maple Street was not just a legal case file or a property record. It was a human one, marked by grief, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. The life of Sarah Ann Jenkins, a woman who sought to live authentically while protecting a private truth, ended violently in her own home. Grim conclusion to a story of identity, secrecy, and the devastating consequences when a partner discovers a reality they cannot or will not accept. The quiet of the Naperville suburb held its secrets, but none as tragic and resonant as the one revealed by a gunshot in a living room.